Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darine Abugaida. U.S. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump blamed his rival Democrat Hillary Clinton and President Barack Obama for the rise of ISIL. He's also criticized NATO for not doing enough to fight terrorism. Well, so far, Trump has not outlined a detailed plan to fight the armed group, but has said that he's willing to work with Russia in Syria rather than alienate it. Clinton supports intensifying airstrikes on the group's fighters and going after its leaders. She says fighting in Syria and Iraq has contributed to ISIL's spread and insists that resolving those conflicts is key to beating the group. Well, according to Trump, her plan for Syria could lead to World War III. He says the focus needs to be on ISIL, not on President Bashar al-Assad.
She gave us ISIS because her and Obama created this huge vacuum. And a small group came out of that huge vacuum because we should have never been in Iraq, but once we were there, we should have never got out the way they wanted to get out. She gave us ISIS as sure as you are sitting there. And what happened is now ISIS is in 32 countries. And now I listen how she's going to get rid of ISIS. She's going to get rid of nobody. We had Mosul. But when she left, when she took everybody out, we lost Mosul. Now we're fighting again to get Mosul. The problem with Mosul and what they wanted to do is they wanted to get the leaders of ISIS who they felt were in Mosul. About 3 months ago, I started reading that they want to get the leaders and they're going to attack Mosul. Whatever happened to the element of surprise? These people have all left. They've all left.
Syria will remain a hotbed of terrorism as long as the civil war aided and abetted by the Iranians and the Russians continue. So I have said, look, we need to keep our eye on ISIS. That's why I want to have an intelligence surge that protects us here at home, why we have to go after them from the air, on the ground, online, why we have to make sure here at home we don't let terrorists buy weapons. If you're too dangerous to fly, you're too dangerous to buy a gun. And I'm going to continue to push for a no-fly zone and safe havens within Syria, not only to help protect the Syrians and prevent the constant outflow of refugees, but to frankly gain some leverage on both the Syrian government and the Russians so that perhaps we can have the kind of serious negotiation necessary to bring the conflict to an end and go forward on a political track.
Let's bring in our guests. Mark Jacobson is a former senior advisor to Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. We have from Amsterdam, Fawaz Jirjas. He's a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. He's also the author of ISIS, A History. Also from Washington, D.C., Robin Simcox. He's a Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Gentlemen, welcome. All of you to Inside Story. Robin, if I may come over to you and get the view from Washington for a second. Now, we know that the average voter in the U.S. is generally concerned with domestic issues and most likely the economy when it comes to the U.S. election. But because the war in Syria as well as the fight against ISIL have both been hotly debated issues between Trump and Clinton, has that at all swayed undecided voters in this election?
I'm not sure if it's going to sway many undecided voters. I certainly think that the issue of terrorism is an extremely hot topic right now in 2016, far more so than it was in 2012, of course, and I think that's mainly to do with the rise of ISIS. But the conversation around ISIS, of course, has centered around Iraq and Syria, yet ISIS has spread way beyond Iraq and Syria now, and that's where I think it's been a little bit disappointing that neither of the candidates have addressed ISIS's growth into countries like Libya, for example, or Afghanistan or Yemen. It's all been based around Syria and Iraq. Of course, those are very important countries, but ISIS's power now is that it's not solely confined to that region. That may be where its base is, but its reach is way beyond Iraq and Syria. It's into the West now, it's into Africa. So I think that in terms of a comprehensive strategy to defeat the group, we're still not really anywhere where we would need to be.
Mark, do you agree with that? And what the two candidates seem to agree on, at least, is that ISIL is a global threat and ISIL must be defeated. If we look at Hillary Clinton for just a moment first, will her policies, if she becomes the U.S. president, be any different from the Obama policy?
In short, I think there's some continuity, but I also think with specific regards to ISIS in Syria, you're going to see some distinctions. After all, Secretary Clinton has called for the establishment of a no-fly or safe zone. Now, saying one supports that is much different than the implementation or execution, which will be complicated. But to a large degree, I agree with Robin. The American voter is interested in foreign policy insofar as they are looking at a potential commander-in-chief, and there are clear distinctions between how Clinton would perform as commander-in-chief and Trump, with significantly less experience, would perform. In fact, this is where I agree with Robin and am equally concerned that there isn't really a discussion in the Trump campaign about how this all links together. You see rather a coddling of the Russians, you see an ignoring of the NATO alliance, where Clinton's approaching it from an internationalist point of view.
Here's the thing, though, Mark, and Fawaz, I'll come over to you in just a moment, but just following up on Mark, what you were saying, Trump has said that he will go hard after ISIL if he's elected president. He has been a little vague on what he will do, but will an ISIL strategy under a Trump presidency be very different from Clinton's?
Right. I think it's very natural for candidates to be vague during an election season. It gives them some flexibility. Where I see consistency between Trump and Clinton is the desire to focus on things such as drone strikes and kinetic activity. The problem is, we all know that you are not going to settle this problem by a military means alone. What Clinton is talking about is looking at it holistically. Let's take a look at Syria, Iraq, Europe. Let's take a look at the instability around the globe. Whereas I see Trump focusing simply on this narrow, kinetic, bomb everybody, bomb the terrorist families. And we've seen that game before and it didn't work. What equally concerns me, though, is that Trump's been very inconsistent. You have an isolationist streak. Bring the troops home. Don't get involved in other quagmires. So we're not quite sure what we're actually going to get after November 9th if there is a Trump presidency.
Fawaz Jirjis in Amsterdam, you've written Trump's pro-ISIS foreign policy. I think that title pretty much explains itself, but just elaborate on that.
First of all, Trump has not only outlined his ideas, he has not fleshed out. He keeps saying he has his strategy, he will defeat ISIS or ISIS in 100 days. It tells you a great deal about his ignorance. It tells you a great deal about his incoherence. It tells you a great deal that he's all over the map. It's not just those candidates, by the way, and Trump to a greater extent. I mean, we're talking here about military strategy, tactics. Neither candidate will send boots on the ground. Hillary Clinton has made it very clear. The lessons of Iraq, she will use American Special Operation Forces, air power, advisors. Her approach will be probably more intensity, more engaged. Trump said he has made it very clear. He will work with Putin, the Russian president, in order to defeat ISIS. The reality is, the big question, what has not been discussed about ISIS is the fact is ISIS or ISIL is a result, a product of broken politics in the Middle East, the fragility of institutions, of foreign intervention, of creeping sectarianism, of regional rivalries. That is, the military part, I would argue, is the least complex and the least really difficult, because even if you defeat ISIS in Mosul, even if you dismantle the so-called the Islamic State or the Caliphate, the political and social and strategic questions will be with us, and these questions are not really, have not been addressed substantively, even though Clinton has addressed them much more than Trump.
Robin, just one point that Fawaz was just mentioning, and that is the point of Russia, where Trump, seems to be more willing to work with Russia when it comes to ISIL in Syria than Clinton. Can you just weigh in on that point?
Well, yes, he seems very clear that that Putin will be an ally. He wants Putin to be an ally in the fight against ISIS. I think this is a great mistake. Putin does not share the same goals as the United States in Syria. Putin wants to ensure that Bashar al-Assad remains in place, which is going to absolutely an enormous mistake and one that will aid recruitment for ISIS in the future. It's also worth clarifying that Trump's willingness to work with Putin even overrides the assessments of his own American intelligence community, who have said again and again that Russia plays a subversive and dangerous role, not just in the world, not just in this region, but also in the American election. Yet time and time again, Trump has seemed to ignore this advice.
But here's the thing, Robin. Trump does seem to say that defeating ISIL is a very high priority, and according to him, which is something that Clinton disputes. He says that it is a much higher priority than President Bashar al-Assad, getting President Bashar al-Assad out of power, which is
I'm
the
sure
U.S.
that-
policy.
I'm sure Donald Trump thinks that. I'm sure that is his top priority. I'm not sure whether he has given too much thought to the internal dynamics of how that plays out in Syria. He just sees ISIS as the main enemy. Of course, this is the group that is threatening Americans, and is probably of much greater concern to the American people than the internal dynamics in Syria. Unfortunately, it takes fixing those internal dynamics in Syria to comprehensively defeat ISIS.
Fawaz Jirjas, how would these internal dynamics be fixed in Syria?
Well, I mean, I think one point must be made very clear. Neither al-Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate, now it's called Jabhat Fath Hasham, or ISIL, or ISIS, or Daesh, would have risen in the first place without the civil war that has been raging in Syria for the past 5 years and a half. So how can you defeat ISIS in Syria if the civil war continues? You have to bridge the divide. You have to glue the country back together. In Iraq as well, ISIS would not have the spectacular surge of ISIS has taken place as a result of the sectarian policies of Noor al-Maliki between 2010 and 2014. The point is, you need a holistic strategy. You need to address the regional rivalries that pour gasoline on a raging fire. You need political transition in Syria. And here, if I were put in Moscow today, I would be celebrating. I would be celebrating the victory of Trump, because Putin expects Trump to basically provide Syria to Russia on a silver platter. And my here speculation, if Hillary Clinton wins on Tuesday, expect major dramatic escalation in Syria, because the Russians are going to escalate. They want to create facts on the ground. They're going to present basically the new administration, the Clinton administration, with a fait accompli, because they expect a more muscular policy on the part of the Clinton administration. And this is why it seems to me Clinton has said that her goal is not just to defeat ISIS militarily, she has to end the civil war. She's concerned about political transition. My take on it, not only there would be continuity between Obama and Clinton, but also some major differences. More muscular strategy, more willingness to use force to deter Russia, and also basically some of her advisors, as you know, Jack Daniels and Pat Morrell, part of her foreign policy team, have made it very clear they're going to basically use the threat of force in order to change the political and strategic dynamics in Syria.
Mark, I see you nodding along to what Fawaz was saying.
Yes, I think Fawaz and Robin have put this very, very eloquently. The Trump policies increase the ability of ISIL to recruit. It increases the instability in the region, and it hands Putin a gift. I mean, this is what's been so incredulous, I think, especially for Robin and his colleagues over at places like Heritage. You have a Republican nominee who's soft on Russia, not looking at countering them in the Middle East, and again, increasing the instability in the region. Now, for Secretary Clinton, if she wins the election on Tuesday, this does not mean she will not have challenges in the Middle East. And I think Fawaz put this very clearly. I think the Russians realize that there will be a window that's closing and that they are going to act fairly quickly. On the other hand, Clinton will also have her hands full with regards to our U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, the Iran deal, and of course the issues between Israel and the Palestinians. You know, long-standing issues, but things that aren't going away just because we have an election next week.
And speaking of relations with other countries, there's also the issue of NATO. Robin, Trump has called NATO outdated. He's called it obsolete, and characterized its members as ungrateful allies who benefit from the United States. So how do you see that relationship with NATO playing out should Trump win the presidency?
Well, I certainly hope it plays out better than the rhetoric at the moment is suggesting it would. I think NATO is the absolute cornerstone in terms of Western security. It's a organisation which has had a hard time recently. I mean, the funding from the European members of NATO is nobody. I think 4 countries in total meet their requirements of 2% GDP that they need to spend on their military. I think it's an organisation that's gone unaddressed in terms of the flaws within it, and there is certainly more that needs to be done on the European front, and Donald Trump seems to be trying to cajole perhaps NATO into increasing its spending. I think that NATO is key here, and certainly the answer is not to disband it or to weaken it, it's to strengthen it.
Here's the thing though, Fawaz, could you argue that this is simply pre-election rhetoric? Because you could say that the US president don't actually decide policies, and those are in fact determined by institutions, they're determined by the elite. So is it just Donald Trump being Donald Trump?
I think you're absolutely correct. We are speculating about the potential international relations of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. The United States is a country of laws, a country of institutions. We need to understand the context. But here it is, we need to understand the concepts behind the rhetoric we have heard. We have a record of Hillary Clinton. She is a realist. She subscribes to realism in international relations. More the same of the Obama administration. She's also well known, as you know, for her interventionist impulse in foreign policy. Donald Trump, conceptually, he views foreign policy through the lens of business. I mean, it's business. Everyone has to pay. He wants to turn the United States into a mercenary power. But the reason why we are concerned about Donald Trump, he is terribly ignorant, he's incoherent, he's all over the map, and he's also fascinated. He has been taken, I mean, with Putin. And this is the irony. I can understand if Donald Trump conceptually lays out his foreign policy and says, we should not get bogged down in a new Cold War with Russia. Russia is a critical player, significant player, and American-Russian alliance could really make a big difference in terms of stability in the Middle East as well. But he does not flesh out these ideas because he does not know foreign policy. He does not listen to his own advisors. And in particular, if he wins, and I hope he does not, his views would be reinforced that he was right all along. You can imagine the turmoil in international relations. Final point, the world is terrified. Where I live in London and Paris and here in Netherlands, they're terrified of the Trump presidency because it's an open page. We don't know what kind of views that he subscribes to in international relations.
Okay, and Mark, you were listening in, and you want to make a point about Trump's comments on NATO?
Yeah, I think I would add a bit of nuance. I mean, again, Trump looks at NATO as a protection racket. There's an uncertainty not just in the Middle East, but look at the Baltics as well. Look at the rhetoric of Moscow with regards to the Norwegians in terms of NATO's defensive build-up there in terms of forces. You have a situation where the NATO allies, for the first time in the history of the alliance, are not quite sure they can count on the United States if there's a Trump presidency. This has worldwide ramifications. And so I understand the fear that's there in Europe. There's a fear here in the United States. But it's this uncertainty, this incoherence, this lack of understanding of how the world works beyond a financial bottom line that has everyone concerned about what a Trump presidency could bring to the United States and to the world.
Well, speaking of the United States itself, let's just pause for a moment and look at this, because Donald Trump has outlined an extensive plan that he says will keep the U.S. itself safe from attacks. He wants to work with Arab allies on aggressive joint and coalition military operations to defeat ISIL and cut off the group's funding, while also using cyber warfare to disrupt ISIL's propaganda and recruitment. Trump has talked a lot about screening refugee applicants to make sure they, quote, support America's values, institutions, and people, and he wants to temporarily suspend immigration from regions that he says export terrorism. On the domestic front, he says he'll create a commission on radical Islam, as he calls it, which will include so-called reformist voices in the Muslim community. And the Republican nominee says he'll pursue aggressive criminal or immigration charges against anyone who funds terrorism. So that is where Donald Trump stands. Now, Hillary Clinton, for example, her policy to fight terrorism, she says this. She'll focus on retaking ISIL's strongholds in Iraq and Syria by intensifying airstrikes and supporting local militias. Clinton has insisted she will not put American troops on the ground to fight ISIL, as the panelists are saying. She's also repeatedly called for targeted airstrikes to kill ISIL leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Clinton also wants to work with European intelligence services to stop people who help attackers forge documents, and with tech companies to fight ISIL's online propaganda and recruitment. On the home front, Clinton says she'll put in place stronger background checks for gun sales to make sure attackers can't buy them, and she wants police to work with American Muslim communities. So that is where they both stand on the issue of counterterrorism in the United States itself. Robin, does anything of what Donald Trump had to say rings a bell with you?
Well, I'm actually not sure that there's that much difference between the two candidates on this front. Obviously, the policy that gets the most attention, has been the most controversial, has been the Donald Trump extreme vetting and the temporary ban on people come from regions that have been afflicted with terrorism, which strikes me as one that plays very well with some of his supporters and some of his base. I'm not entirely sure how it would work, or if indeed whether it would happen. But there's some continuity there between the Obama administration and between a potential Trump and Clinton administration. The need to crack down on how ISIS uses the internet to recruit people, the need to work with allies in the region. I think these are largely uncontroversial things. To me, the Hillary Clinton strategy is largely a continuity from Barack Obama, and I think you'd have to say if President Obama's policy is working, they're working very slowly and probably not at a pace that the American public are largely comfortable with. So Donald Trump's message of really ramping this war up probably plays quite well with quite a few Americans, I think, and perhaps even some within NATO who are uncomfortable with how the war on ISIS is progressing.
Mark, do you agree with that? Do you think there's continuity between Obama's policies and Clinton and Trump? Fawaz, I see you. I'll come over to you in just a second.
I think there's continuity, except in two very key places. The first, as Robin alluded to, is the immigration issue, and that leads directly to American values. And I think there's a very distinct difference between the values that Donald Trump represents, especially in terms of this idea of building walls, isolating us, frankly a xenophobic streak that's in the United States but doesn't raise its ugly head except from time to time. I think the other area where you see a distinct difference is in the willingness to approach the issue of guns on the American street. And that, of course, is a political third rail in this country. Trump supporters arguing that the federal government under Clinton will take away our guns, and this has been running through different presidencies for the last several decades, whereas President Clinton has articulated that what her concern is, and the concern of the Democratic Party is, we don't want a loophole whereby people on the no-fly list can get weapons. I think that's a very reasonable step, but again, it illustrates two ideological differences between the candidates that resonate very clearly.
Thoughts.
I mean, first of all, you're right. Trump, really, if you listen carefully and closely to what he says, he borrows from both parties, the Republican and the Democrats party. But he's an isolationist at heart. But more importantly, I would argue, not only Putin is cheering for a Trump presidency, but even ISIS, because Trump's rhetoric regarding culture and Muslims and Islam and minorities plays into the hands of ISIS. ISIS basically has a view of foreign policy in terms of the clash of civilization, and that's what Trump says, and that's why the world is terrified of a Trump presidency. No, Europe is not really upset with the slow pace of the fight against ISIS, because Barack Obama knows very well it's not about basically getting Mosul and Raqqa. It's the morning after. How do you bridge the sectarian divide? How do you dismantle, the networks that exist? How do you resolve the regional rivalries? These are complex questions. They take not only months and years, probably a decade or two.
Okay, on that note, we'll leave it there. Very interesting. We'll certainly be watching what happens on election night and the day after the election. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Mark Jacobson, Fawaz Jirgis, and Robin Simcox. And thank you very much for watching. You can always